Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. Got you covered. Traditional league, dynasty league, PPR league, IDP league, even daily fantasy football league. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Thank you for tuning in to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. Always, I'm your host, Jeremiah, and this is episode 36 on January 17th, 2017. All right, well, it is time to discuss what we have seen this past weekend in the divisional round. We've seen a lot of great performances. We did indeed. Of course, I will talk about every game that happened this past weekend, as well as the top performers from each game. And we have some really great top performers. So, yes. We have Le'Veon Bell, who broke a postseason rushing record. We have Aaron Rodgers just being amazing again. Matt Ryan can't be stopped. And Patriots just keep on being the Patriots. That's all I got to say. But there's like so many games that I can talk about first. But I think the one game I want to talk about to get started here would be probably the great game that we saw in Dallas, which was between the Packers and the Cowboys. And man, this was a very, very classic game. Very classic game. Was the pressure going to be too high on Dak, Ezekiel, this Dallas team, and Green Bay having the hottest quarterback, the hottest offense in the league right now? This game did not disappoint. So the Cowboys did go off to a slow start. And, Dak was really resilient in this game. He did finish the game with 302 yards, 3 touchdowns. Ezekiel Elliott also rushed for 125 and 22 carries. And Dez Bryant had a real good game. This is one of our guys that we talked about on Friday that you probably should avoid starting. But man, we were so wrong on this because he probably had the second, maybe the third best performance in this game. And we kept saying he's very inconsistent. Dez Bryant put on the show, 132 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns, had 12 targets. And don't forget about Jason Witten. He also had a really good game, 59 yards and 1 touchdown on 9 targets. And Jason Witten did say he is going to come back in 2017, so maybe the chemistry would grow with Witten and Prescott. Ezekiel Elliott, I did talk about him briefly. He did have a real good game. He did have a really good play in the fourth quarter when he did the spin move on Clay Matthews. He's looking like Barry Sanders there. Some people say he looks like Emmitt Smith. I think he looked a little bit more like Barry Sanders. And, it's too late I think it's too early to say Ezekiel Elliott is the best running back in the game. We do have Le'Veon Bell, who I'm going to talk about later in the show. We do have David Johnson. But Ezekiel Elliott, I think if he has another good year, I think he's going to be in that conversation as the best running back in the game. I think it's too early to speculate on that. But, Dak finished the game very efficient. Ezekiel Elliott finished the game really well. I do think these are guys. Ezekiel Elliott is going to go in the top 3 in the draft next year. And a lot of fantasy drafts, I think Dak Prescott will be a late rounder. I think he's going to be someone that's going to be taken seriously in fantasy. I think Dak's going to get even better from here on out. Remember, Dak's a rookie. I think we always forget about that. Dak's a rookie, and he looked really good in the playoff game. He brought his team back from a double-digit deficit. And Dak Prescott is one of those guys I'm very excited about next year in fantasy. And Dez Bryant, I think, is someone that can be really good. I think he might be a little overrated a little bit as being a first rounder because he was very inconsistent. I can see him being a second rounder. But I do think he will be very valuable. I think the chemistry with him and Dak got a lot better. And I think he's someone that you can really take a chance on probably in the second round in fantasy drafts. Man, so the Cowboys, they're going to have a lot of fantasy relevant players next year. So I would be excited if I was a Dallas Cowboys fan because the future is bright. As for the Packers, what can I say? You know, this game didn't have Jordy Nelson, which was scary to think about. If Jordy Nelson played in this game probably wouldn't even be any close. No, Jordy Nelson did miss this game because of a rib injury, and he's Aaron Rodgers' best target. Aaron Rodgers did finish the game with 356 passing yards and 2 touchdowns. And his main target of the day was Jared Cook. Yes. Jared Cook had 11 targets, 6 receptions, 104 yards, and 1 touchdown. Remember, this is the guy I said you got to start. He was one of my sleepers this week, and I was right about that. He was a sleeper. I was so glad to see him prove me right. And I want to talk about that catch at the end that set up that game-winning field goal. That was probably the best catch Jared Cook will ever have. And I'm going to let you know, a lot of people didn't even know who Jared Cook was before this game. I did, obviously. I talked about him on Friday. I know Jared Cook used to play for the Rams when they were in St. Louis, so I know who he was. But, man, I was so glad to have that right. You have no idea. And another favorite target of Aaron Rodgers was Devontae Adams. He did have 10 targets, did have 5 receptions, but only mustered up 76 yards. And Randall Cobb was highly involved as well. More in the short passing game. He did have 8 targets, 7 receptions, and 62 yards. And Tom Montgomery was actually very effective in this game. He had a really good solid performance as a running back. He was involved in the passing game. Tom Montgomery did finish with 47 rushing yards and 34 receiving yards and did have 2 touchdowns on the ground. So, you know, the running game is not a very focal point in this offense. This offense is kind of a very conventional offense, and Aaron Rodgers makes it look like it's not, but it really is. So, you know, with Ty Montgomery getting those short 2 touchdowns, I was wrong on sitting him. He was someone I did say stay away from the Green Bay backfield because I really thought that Aaron Rodgers was going to air it out, and he did. It's just that the Packers decided to run the ball on short field, which is something they should have done. But, you know, the Packers do move on to play the Falcons, who I will talk about in a little bit. But they do play the Falcons, and this is a game that I really cannot wait to see. We're going to see 2 quarterbacks practically playing for the MVP, practically playing for a chance to play in the Super Bowl. And I think the Packers and the Falcons have the makings of a 52-49 game, and that bodes well for fantasy. Well, of course, we will talk about that game specifically on Friday, and I will talk about that game in a little bit. But, you know, I was very impressed with this Dallas Cowboys young offense. I do think they're going to be back even better next year. I just think they got to get some defense there. And Green Bay, of course, they will move on to play Atlanta in the NFC Championship on Sunday. And that will lead me to my first break. And when I get back, I will talk about that Atlanta and Seattle game. When we get back to the Goes to Me Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA, from the UFC to extreme cage fighting. They got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Well, Aaron Rodgers wasn't only the hottest quarterback in the league. Matt Ryan of the Atlanta Falcons was also on fire heading into Saturday's divisional game against the Seattle Seahawks. And dating back to December 11th, Matt Ryan has thrown for 11 touchdowns and 0 interceptions. Now, on top of it all off, he finishes an MVP year with 38 touchdowns in the regular season. And man, did he look like he was the MVP against the Falcons. I know the Falcons. Not the Falcons, but I know the Seattle Seahawks, they weren't completely healthy on defense. But, they still have Russell Wilson. They still got playmakers in the offensive side of the field. But, this Falcons team was just way too much to handle. And they look like they are a force to be reckoned with. And I am very excited to see this offense going against this Green Bay Packers offense. It's going to be Matt Ryan versus Aaron Rodgers. And Matt Ryan, I think he a little bit under the radar, so to speak. He has been highly talked about. There was a lot of pressure on Matt Ryan to perform in this game, too. Matt Ryan, he has the weapons around him. He has 2 really good running backs. He has tons of weapons at the receiving position. He has a really good offensive line. So there was no excuse for Matt Ryan to not perform. And, man, not only did he perform, but this whole entire team performed. That defense played very solidly. And then when you have an offense like that, of course your defense is going to be more motivated to play. But, Matt Ryan, he finished the game with 338 yards and 3 touchdowns, averaged 9.1 yards per attempt. And he actually spread the ball out pretty well. Devontae Freeman was the leading receiver with 4 receptions, 80 yards. Tyler Gabriel was involved in this game with 71 yards and 4 receptions. Julio Jones did have a touchdown with 67 yards on 6 receptions, and Mohamed Sanu had the other one with 44 yards and a touchdown, and Tevin Coleman had a 3rd touchdown reception for Matt Ryan, who finished with 22 receiving yards. And for the running backs, Tevin Coleman did have 57 yards rushing, as well as Freeman has 45 yards on the ground with a touchdown. So with Tevin Coleman and Devontae Freeman scoring, I believe this was the 4th time this whole entire year that both of them scored, in which I thought that would have happened more often, especially with the way this offense is played. But this offense is so balanced, it's hard to find touches for all these players. And I talked about Green Bay being the hottest team. Atlanta is just as hot as they are. They have a quarterback who is an MVP candidate, who he might be playing for the MVP award against Aaron Rodgers. They have really good dynamic running backs, and they had, I think, a top 3 receiver in the league. You can make a case that he is probably the number 1 receiver in Julio Jones. But, I'm expecting a very good performance from this group heading into the game against Green Bay. And it is the last game at the Georgia Dome. And what way to have a send-off and a championship game for a chance to go to the Super Bowl. And as for the Seahawks in this game, Russell Wilson was the leading rusher, and that pretty much tells you the entire story of this game. The Seahawks are historically a run-first team. They have no really star running back. Thomas Rawls did lead with carries with 11, only finished with 34. Wilson was the leading receiver. Like I said, he only had 49 rushing yards. Russell Wilson, overall, as a passer, finished with 225 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, did throw 2 picks. And, this team, they just couldn't find any rhythm on offense after a while. Because, the Falcons had a 19-point second quarter, and it's tough to stop that. And my favorite player from the Seahawks this postseason was Paul Richardson. He's made some really good plays. He looked like he can be a really good deep threat for Russell Wilson next season. I really do think he can be a deep threat next season. He's more of a boom or bust player in fantasy, but I do like him. Doug Baldwin did finish with 80 yards and a touchdown. And Jimmy Graham also had a touchdown in this game with 22 yards. As for Paul Richardson, I forgot to say his stats. He finished with 83 yards and 4 receptions. But as heading to next year, Russell Wilson is a legitimate quarterback. As for the running backs position, we don't know. CJ Prosise did look like he can be a really good running back in this offense. Alex Collins hasn't really shown me a whole lot. Thomas Rawls has been really good. Maybe when he's at home, he's really good. And as far as the receivers, I do like Paul Richardson. Doug Baldwin's a really good receiver in fantasy. Jimmy Graham, no doubt, is a top 5 tight end in fantasy. So that's the team that I look moving forward for this team. And as for the night game on Saturday, it was the New England Patriots and the Houston Texans. There really isn't a whole lot to say about this game except for, Tom Brady still being Tom Brady. Tom Brady did throw 2 picks in this game after throwing literally only 2 picks the whole entire year. He did finish with 28 touchdowns and 2 interceptions, which is the best, honestly, touchdown to interception ratio NFL history. And he did finish with 287 yards, and he just couldn't be stopped. And this defense did play well through 3 quarters, but it is hard to play well against this type of offense when your offense can't even score. Dion Lewis was the player in this game. He's the first player ever in NFL history to have 1 rushing touchdown, 1 receiving touchdown, and 1 kickoff return touchdown in a playoff game. So he was the fantasy player in this game. I don't know if he's going to do that against the Steelers, but I do expect him to be highly involved in this game. He did get 13 carries and 41 yards in the ground. And if he's not involved in the ground game, I do expect him to be involved highly in the passing game. And as far as, I did say to start the Gary Blunt because I did think that this game was going to be a blowout, and it was. But Gary Blunt wasn't highly involved in this game at all. He only had 8 carries and 31 yards. And I thought he would have had a better performance. Julian Edelman was the top receiver for the Patriots, finishing with 137 yards. He had 13 targets and 8 receptions. Chris Hogan had a really good night. 95 yards on 4 targets, 4 receptions. As far as the 2 touchdown receptions for the Patriots, Dion Lewis had 1 and James White had the other one. But as far as the Houston Texans go, they couldn't get a whole lot going on offense. Brock Osweiler showed me that he cannot be a capable quarterback. He did have 3 interceptions, 1 touchdown, and 198 yards. Lamar Miller has 73 yards on 19 carries. He didn't do a whole lot, only averaged 3.8. DeAndre Hopkins only had 65 yards. And, of course, Anthony's boy, CJ Fedorowicz, had a touchdown and 36 yards. And there was a chance for Brock Osweiler to get another touchdown. He did throw it deep to Will Fuller in the third quarter, and Will Fuller dropped it. It should have been a touchdown. It probably could have changed the game. It could have made it a one-score game, put a little more pressure on the Patriots, but Will Fuller dropped it, and I don't know. I think he's someone that you really can't. I think he's someone that's mainly going to be on the waiver wire to start the year in fantasy, Will Fuller. But as far as DeAndre Hopkins, I still think he has a chance to be a first-round pick. But with the year that he's had, he's probably going to be a second-round pick. I wouldn't be surprised. Lamar Miller, he had really good games, but he just hasn't showed up to the playoffs. He just really hasn't, and this is the reason why they brought him here. They brought Lamar Miller to be a playoff performer, and he hasn't been. And I know he had a touchdown against the Raiders in the wildcard game, but he had 31 carries for like 75 yards, and that's not good. It's not good at all. But I'm going to take one final break, and I'm going to talk about the Steelers and Chiefs game, the fourth game of the divisional weekend, and I would break it down as best as I can, and I will talk about Le'Veon Bell making history when we get back to the Going to Me Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Well, one of the best fantasy football players this postseason happens to be none other than Le'Veon Bell. Sure, you can probably make an argument for Aaron Rodgers, but man, Le'Veon Bell is making history. It's making history. Le'Veon Bell, he ran for 170 yards Sunday night against the Kansas City Chiefs. Before that, ran for 167 yards against the Dolphins. Now, he's been the workhorse. He is one of the 4 players in NFL history with back-to-back playoff games of at least 150 yards, according to Pro Football Reference. And the other 3 guys that he is joining are Franco Harris, Marcus Allen, and Terrell Davis. So, a thing that I want to point out is that Le'Veon Bell outgained the Chiefs' entire offense through 3 quarters, which was 150. And despite Le'Veon Bell's huge day, the Pittsburgh Steelers only won by 2 points, 18-16, but are moving on to face the Patriots in the AFC Championship. And this is another good game that I'm looking forward to. I really want to see Le'Veon Bell, see what he can do against this Patriots defense. Because, this Patriots defense is really very underrated. Very underrated. And they're not talked about a lot because of Tom Brady and that offense. But Le'Veon Bell, with his huge numbers, he has 337 rushing yards. Yes. And I believe those are the most rushing yards ever in a running back's first 2 playoff games. So he's making history in the first time he's ever played in playoff games. And we're finally seeing Le'Veon Bell in the playoffs, and it is very exciting. Man, and I was just watching this game, and I was like, man, look at the patience that he runs with. It is flat out phenomenal the way that Le'Veon Bell plays the game. Well, outside of Le'Veon Bell, we did have some really good performances in the Steelers. And, of course, Antonio Brown did have a game over 100 yards receiving. He finished with 108, 6 receptions out of 11 targets. Jesse James had made some really good plays. He did finish with 83 yards on 6 targets and 5 receptions. Ben Roethlisberger didn't really do a whole lot. He did finish with 224 games. Did have 1 interception, but averaged 7.2 yards per attempt. As for the Chiefs, weren't a whole lot of really notable fantasy players, and they did have the only 2 touchdowns in this game. Because, Chris Boswell, I should say, did have an NFL record 6 field goals in a playoff game. So he was another fantasy stud in your daily lineups there. But as for the Chiefs, the really good performers were Travis Kelce with 77 yards and 7 targets. That was the highest receiver on the Chiefs. The next highest was Jeremy Maclin with 28. Tyreek Hill had a really disappointing game. I thought he would be involved a lot more. He did have 27 yards receiving and did have 18 yards rushing. Spencer Ware did have a pretty rough game with 35 rushing yards, only 1 touchdown. And Al Smith didn't do a whole lot, only mustering up 172 passing yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception. So the best player in this game was none other than Le'Veon Bell. And I do think he's someone that, of course, he's going to be a must start. But I am loving what I'm seeing from Le'Veon Bell in the playoffs. And he is showing why he is the best running back in all of the NFL. Best all-around running back, most patient running back, best running back. He does it all. He does it all. He's always involved in the passing game as well. He just does it all. But enough about talking Le'Veon Bell. I have to end the show, and I know it's hard to see me go. I know you don't want me to leave, but I have to. And I'd like to thank you guys for tuning in to the Going to Me Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. You can catch the show on a variety of platforms: iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, YouTube, and of course on the website GSMCpodcast.com. You can follow the show on Twitter at GSMC_football and on Instagram at the same handle, that is at GSMC_football. You can also like the show on Facebook at the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. As always, I'm Jeremiah. Anthony will be back on Friday. We will be discussing championship weekend, and I can't wait for those games. But yeah, I'd like to thank you guys for tuning in, and I will see you guys later this week.